Hey folks, in this second video from chapter 17 on the biopsychology of emotion, we're going to talk first about emotional communication, and then we're going to talk about anatomy, so which parts of the brain are involved in emotion. Let's get started. So first, it's pretty easy to note if you just look around the world, and if you do it more systematically like biologists do, that animals express emotions pretty consistently. So within a species like dogs, they'll pretty consistently be able to express from dog to dog, and then across species as well, that when they're happy, when they're aggressive, and when they're submissive. And you can see pictures of aggression and submission of dogs here on the slide. And if you notice that happens consistently, so every dog basically does it the same way, well, why are they doing it, right? What is the function of communicating emotions like that? Well, Charles Darwin and many others after him suggested that what we use emotional expressions to communicate efficiently within and across species. So, for example, a threat display, like the aggression display from the dog, is actually a way of preventing fighting, right? So if a dog wanted to fight, right, it wouldn't put its hackles up and growl, right? It would just fight. So a dog that puts its hackles up and growls is communicating a feeling, an anger or aggression feeling, right? Which actually might scare another dog off or prompt the dog to display submission feeling, right, of fear, right, so that the fight can be avoided, right? Because even an aggressive dog is better off if it doesn't fight, because it might get injured even if it's the stronger dog, right? So displaying emotions is a good way to stay alive. And so this suggests that there may be something universal within a species that's potentially innate, that's born into us, to express emotions in certain universal ways that we all have. At least this works for dogs, right? Well, what about humans, right? So humans tend to express our emotions through facial expressions, and you can see some of them on the screen here. And some researchers tried to identify which of these expressions, now there's a lot of subtlety, right? But which of these expressions might be basic or fundamental or universal, and ultimately what might be innate to us as a species because of that. A researcher by the name of Ekman proposed that there are 6 that are universal. And you can see pictures of those 6 on the right. Now some of these are going to be easier to name than others, but most of these are going to be pretty straightforward in terms of how you interpret them, and I'll give you a second to do that. Ekman proposed that these were pretty universal, and his evidence for that was that he could take people from different cultures who hadn't ever traveled to the other area, so Westerners where Ekman was from, and then people from New Guinea, and the Westerners had never traveled to New Guinea, and vice versa. And gave pictures of people from the other culture, had them identify or differentiate the different emotions from the expressions, and found that they were pretty consistent and pretty strong agreement between them, suggesting that maybe happiness, right, has the same facial expression regardless of where you were born. Same thing with sadness, right? I'll give you the answers to those emotions here. On the top, we've got anger, disgust, and fear. On the bottom, happiness, sadness, and surprise. Now, you might not have been able to name every one of them, but now that you look at them and you see them matched up, I think you'd be able to identify, based on the names, which ones go with which pretty well, right? So not 100%, but pretty good. And Ekman would say that even if you're not from the same part of the country or the world that you're from, you'd pretty much be able to do this to these faces as well as you just did. Now, there's some complexity to think about here as we think about, okay, so there's just 6 emotions, there's 6 expressions, and it's the same for everybody. there's some complexity. So first of all, what we call like a basic expression is quite differentiated. So there's wide variability, including micro expressions and fake expressions. So in the picture on the right, we have two smiles. So if we call, smiling a basic expression of happiness, well, on the left we have what's called a Duchenne smile, and on the right we have a fake smile, right? And the Duchenne smile includes the eyes a lot more, you can see, right? Now these are both smiles, right? Are these both the same basic expression? Well, maybe, but there's subtle differences between them that are real, right? Because the fake smile may communicate something very different from a real smile. It's also true that facial expressions aren't the only thing we use to express emotions. Just like dogs, right? We use posture, right? We get our hackles up, or we bend down, right? And so think about how you might display pride or confidence, right? And that might show up on your face a little bit, but it will also show up in your posture, right? There's also some cultural differences. So, for example, surprise, fear, and anger were three of the basic emotions that Ekman proposed. Others have proposed that in some cultures, shame, pride, and guilt might be easier to identify than surprise, fear, and anger are. Right? So think about what shame and pride look like in terms of a facial expression to you, and that facial expression might be easier identified for some people than for others. Some evidence of that. There's also, when we think about posture and we think about gestures, those other ways of expressing emotions besides faces, those definitely differ across cultures. Right? So, for example, there's sometimes referred to as the Indian head nod, right? Is included as a way of communicating emotions. So you can smile and then move your head in different ways, at different paces, and the facial expression can stay the same, but the emotion communicated or the intention communicated can be quite different. Next question, right, is, okay, what's going on in our brains to get these emotions in the first place? And you've probably been told in this class and in others that the amygdala is where we do emotions. The amygdala sits in the limbic system, and the limbic system more generally is going to have a role in emotional processing. But the amygdala in particular, you can see where it is in this limbic system. The limbic system sits kind of inside the brain. You can see we've got the cerebral cortex outside of it, and the limbic system kind of like wraps around on the inside. And the amygdala is right at the end of the hippocampus. The hippocampus, is involved in forming new explicit memories. And the amygdala is this almond-shaped structure at the end of it. There's overwhelming evidence that the amygdala is involved and is potentially critical for processing fear, particularly. So damage to the amygdala reduces behaviors that are linked to fear. There's a condition called Kluver-Bucy syndrome, where identified in chimpanzees, I believe. Some kind of ape, I'm pretty sure it's chimpanzees, with Kluver-Bucy syndrome, where they get damage to their amygdala and become fearless. They become hypersexual. They explore things with their mouth, right? So normally we should have a healthy fear of just putting random things in our mouth, of having random sex with other members of the species, and maybe jumping from tree branch to tree branch. We should be hesitant to do all of these things unless we're sure that it's safe, right? But damage to the amygdala removes that sort of healthy wariness. In humans, there's a condition called Erbath-Wieth disease, where there are a few cases, SM and SP, who've had damage to the amygdala through this particular disease, who also similarly display a lack of fearlessness. So, for example, in one case, there was a woman who used to be afraid of snakes, and then after developing this condition, they took her to a pet shop, and there was a boa constrictor at the pet shop, and she just reached right into the cage to grab the boa constrictor. So that normal fear she would express just wasn't expressing anymore. So that's neuropsychological evidence that damage to the amygdala leads to a lack of fear response. There's also experimental evidence through conditioning, where you can present a threatening sound, like in the picture here, right? And condition that sound to different stimuli. Okay, so a previously neutral stimulus, right, like a sound, right, can get paired with something that's dangerous, like a shock to the feet, right? And what happens when you do that is that you get connections through the thalamus, which is our sensory relay where we're processing the sound. The thalamus is going to go to the auditory cortex where we hear the sound, but it's also going to connect to the amygdala where we process fear. And what we see is that damage to the thalamus, if you do an experimental lesion to the thalamus or an experimental lesion to the amygdala, either way is going to prevent an animal from learning to be afraid of the sound, right? So you play the sound, you shock their feet. You play the sound, you shock their feet. And they are conditioned to fear the sound. If you damage the thalamus, which prevents the signal from getting to the amygdala in the first place, or you would damage the amygdala, either way you prevent the learning, right? If you damage the auditory cortex, you don't prevent the learning, which tells us that it's not the sensory signal that is being feared, right, by itself, because it's not the auditory cortex where we're processing the sensory signal that you damage, right? It's the processing of that signal in the amygdala that's critical. Right? And we know now what happens after the amygdala, right? So through the same sorts of fear conditioning studies, right, we can show that the threatening sound sets off a chain of activity to the thalamus, to the amygdala, and then to the hypothalamus, where we're going to have our hormone response, and then also down through the hindbrain, the periaqueductal gray, to get a behavioral response in our body. Okay? So this amygdala, if it gets damaged naturally, or if we manipulate it experimentally, seems to be critical to this fear processing circuit. But it turns out that the amygdala is not the only part of the brain that's involved in emotions. Okay? And in fact, the amygdala seems to be attuned particularly to fear, and other emotions seem to recruit other areas. Now, there's a lot of research on emotions, and your book in this page is just going to break down a general summary of what we find when we look at more complex emotions in humans, and we put them in scanners like fMRI scanners. And generally what we find is that brain activity with each emotion is diffuse. So whereas fear seems to rely on the amygdala and other areas, an emotion like happiness or pride doesn't seem to have just one part of the brain that does it. There isn't a happiness part of the brain. The other thing that we find is that when we experience emotions, we typically get activity in our motor and sensory cortex areas. You can see that here, the motor cortex is activated. Which is interesting, right? Because it suggests that there's an embodiment of emotions in our brain, where we're kind of like moving in response to the emotions, or simulating or preparing movement in response to emotions. Another interesting finding from cognitive neuroscience and emotion is that you get similar brain activity, this kind of diffuse activation that includes motor and sensory reactions. We get that same response regardless of whether we are experiencing the emotion ourselves, whether we're imagining the emotion, or whether we're viewing someone else experiencing the emotion. And the final one, where you view somebody else experiencing the emotion, some people have attributed to what are called mirror neurons, because almost like we're looking at ourselves in the mirror, but when we're looking at other people. And so we essentially simulate the emotion in our own mind physiologically, in our own brain physiologically, by seeing the other person, and that's useful for empathy. Okay, so you can see that it's not just the amygdala involved here. We've got diffuse areas of the brain involved in emotions, including motor and sensory areas, and all of this can be activated through actually experiencing the emotions or imagining or viewing emotions. The next part of the brain to focus on, though, is the medial prefrontal lobes. And we learned about the medial prefrontal lobe through a famous case of Phineas Gage. Here's a reconstruction of the brain injury to Phineas Gage, who was a railroad worker who had a spike driven through his skull and survived. You can see that it came up sort of underneath his left eye and then up through the medial or middle part of the very front of his frontal lobes, and flew right on up and out of his head. And what we found from his case was that Phineas Gage had a lot of issues, not in experiencing emotions, but in regulating emotions, which led to a lot of follow-up research that has provided additional evidence that this part of the brain, the medial part of our prefrontal cortex, is involved in emotional regulation. Okay, so this is an area of emotion, cognition, interaction, more generally. So it involves controlling emotional responses, which you can demonstrate through a suppression task or a reappraisal task. What do I mean by that? Well, if you look at a picture like this on the right, this picture has a negative connotation to it. And so in a suppression task, you would be shown a picture like that and given the instruction to suppress any emotional response. In a reappraisal task, you would be asked to reinterpret this picture as positive, right? Maybe these are actors in a play doing a good job, or maybe these people are seeing their child graduate from high school or something like that, right? So in either way, what would normally lead to a negative reaction is either being suppressed or reappraised. And the medial prefrontal cortex gets involved in both of those kinds of emotional control tasks. Now, emotional control is pretty useful, right? Being able to control my emotional response can help me live up to social norms so I don't have an emotional outburst in a situation where it's not acceptable. It can help me cope, at least with the immediate reaction to an emotional stimulus. And can also be, in the terms of reappraisal, can be useful for therapy, right? So some thoughts about myself that might give me an emotional response or anxiety, I could reappraise and have control over that emotional reaction. But the medial prefrontal lobes, like I said, is involved in emotion and cognition more generally, not just control. It also processes outcomes and expectancy. So when I lose, like in gambling or any other disappointment, I should have a healthy negative reaction to loss, which should probably make me avoid that thing in the future a little bit more, right? So I bet on the horses and I lose all my money. That should lead to a negative reaction and update my expectation of winning in the future. And as long as I'm processing that information rationally with my medial prefrontal lobes, right, I should update and gamble less in the future. The medial prefrontal cortex also gets involved in moral decision making. And just briefly, if you're in my class, you can play with the trolley problem online in supplemental materials. But just briefly, there's a number of moral decision-making tasks that have complex or difficult decisions that people need to make. And moral decisions on these kinds of tasks seem to depend in part in our processing of the emotional consequences of our decisions. And this is based on activity in the medial prefrontal cortex. So the trolley problem below is a classic example, right? There's a trolley running down the track. It's either going to hit 5 people or 1 person. Should you pull this lever to move the trolley so that it'll run over just 1 person versus 5, right? And lots of people will say, yes, you should pull the lever because 1 person dying is better than 5 people dying. In this scenario, you would have to actively push a person off of a bridge to stop the trolley to prevent the 5 people from dying. And people have more difficulty with this one because actively causing harm to somebody like that leads to an emotional reaction, right? And we simulate what it would feel like to do that, right? And we include that reasoning in our moral decision making about whether this would now still be a moral choice to make, okay? And moral decision making like that, even rational moral decision making, counts our emotional responses as part of our calculus. At least that's how we normally operate. Okay, so the medial prefrontal cortex is really important for emotions, controlling them, right? Updating based on emotional reactions to loss, and also making decisions, right? Making real moral decisions that are based on our feelings. Okay, so it's not just the amygdala. There's wide activation, including motor and sensory cortex, and then the medial prefrontal lobes involved in that more complex process.